welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wade. I'm very excited to introduce you to my guest today. She's an expert in clinical and organizational psychology, specializing in helping passionate and motivated people work through bureaucratic and inefficient process to achieve their goals. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Jennifer Wisdom with us today. Jennifer Wisdom is a licensed and board-certified psychologist who now is an author, consultant, and speaker. She's worked with complex healthcare, government, and educational environments for 25 years, including serving in the U.S. military, working with nonprofit service delivery programs, and as faculty in higher education. She now provides consulting, coaching, and training in healthcare and academic workplaces. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Jennifer, first thing I want to do is thank you for your service as a veteran. I always want to make sure I thank all the veterans that come on the show. So thank you for the service. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was an honor to serve.
Great. And then I just want to jump right into it because there's so many interesting things that I want to ask you about. How did you get from, being the veteran, being in the military, doing clinical and organizational psychology? How did you get into the business world?
Yeah, absolutely. So it almost feels like I was cheating to get into the business world. I wasn't cheating, but the business world that I'm in is the business of healthcare and academia, both of which are big business, as you know, in this country and around the world. And a lot of my time as an academic was working in academic medical centers, working in the hospital systems, working with nonprofit mental health and substance use treatment programs, teaching about health systems organization. So kind of moving from doing that work and researching it and teaching it as an academician to moving over into working with them as a consultant was a really easy switch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that sounds like that it was just something that happened naturally then.
I don't know if I would say naturally. It definitely gave it a bit of a push. Academia is it's its own world for people who haven't been in it. And those of you who are in it definitely know it's its own world. I really enjoyed being an academic. I thought I would do that for the rest of my life, but I found that I was spending a lot more time trying to get things to work and less time actually working. Like I wasn't able to spend as much time as I wanted doing the things that I wanted to do. I want to teach people to be leaders. I want to help leaders. I want to make change in organizations. And there was a lot of other stuff that I needed to spend time doing in academia, grading papers and going to faculty meetings and dealing with politics and all this other stuff. And so ultimately I ended up making a pretty challenging, a really difficult decision to say, I'm going to leave this venue and try to do the same kind of work as an independent consultant. And of course, being an entrepreneur has pros and cons, but it's worked out, and I love the work that I'm doing, and I am able to spend more time doing what I love doing and less time doing the stuff I don't love as much. So that feels like a win.
This is really interesting because you're striking a chord with me here. I remember one of the things that surprised me when I first went into graduate school is that even in academic settings, there was a lot of politics and there's a lot of bureaucracy. And I remember thinking, okay, this is going to be the place where it's pure academics. We're all just going to be learning and just achieving together. And I ran into a lot of politics and bureaucracy. So I'm wondering, how did you manage and navigate that? Because I found it very hard.
Well, I found it very hard as well. When I finished my degree and I got my first job as a faculty member, and I said to myself, quite naively, I'm not going to do academic politics. And what was I thinking? I was all of 29 years old or something. But, the first week, somebody tried to take my staff. They tried to take my equipment. They tried to take my space. I was like, holy cow, at minimum, you have to do defensive politics. And I suppose I've heard stories, I've heard legends of academic workplaces that are not very political or that are not as sharky, people aren't.
Where are these places?
I don't know. I've heard they exist, but some people have had those experiences, and it was fascinating working with your colleague, our colleague and psychologist Mira Brancu,
Hmm.
about workplace politics because
Hmm.
both of us were really interested in it. And it after we had a number of conversations around writing that book, Millennials Guide to Workplace Politics,
Hmm.
it became clear she's really focused on preventive strategies
Hmm.
for how to present yourself in the workplace and how to move things forward. And I don't know if it's because I've got more years on her or because the kinds of places that I was, but I was really focused on intervention strategies
Hmm.
around when people take credit for your work or they're backstabbing you or they're,
Yeah.
whatever bad thing happens, now what? And so it ended up being a really nice partnership as we were writing that because we both had very different experiences and very different strategies for how to deal with workplace politics.
That sounds like a really cool collaboration that the two of you were able to do, right? Yeah, in the book that you came
Absolutely.
up with. Yeah. Now, one of the things
Absolutely.
that I think is really cool about the work that you do is you're working in one of the areas that I think is, the worst for politics, which is in academia. But politics is everywhere. I mean, that's one of the things that I was actually running away from when I went to academia. I was running away from politics in the business world, and I thought, okay, academia is the place to go. But apparently, it really was not. And so, talk to us a little bit about how you see politics in business, and how you either avoid it or use it, or or are able to use it to your advantage to be successful in business.
Sure, sure. I think the first thing to think about is politics has such a bad rap because
Hmm.
people always think of politics as cutthroat, dirty politics, bad stuff, backstabbing. But politics is really the word we use when humans are negotiating about how to get stuff done.
Hmm.
You want one thing, I want something else. How are we going to work this out? That's politics.
I love
And
the
it
way
could
you
be
frame that. That's really, I've never heard it framed that way, and I love that approach. Yeah.
Yeah. And it may be that, I mean, I don't know, maybe you want, let's use an actual, government example. You want a new water plant in your city and I
Hmm.
want a new garbage dump in the city. And so how are we going to make this happen? Maybe you and I can negotiate to fund both our projects and then we both get wins. Or maybe, you're going to go talk to the, I don't know, the water people and get them to release, some smear about me or something. Who knows, right? There's
Hmm.
so many different ways to negotiate this. Some I tend to prefer being very direct. I'm very, what you see is what you get. I want to have the conversation. So if I know you want that money for the water plant, I want it for the garbage dump. How about you and I talk about it and let's figure out how can we come up with a plan that works for everybody. Now that
Hmm.
is not very common as far as how people tend to negotiate, especially when you get money and power and constituencies and all those other things involved. Or in
Yeah.
academia, when you have a bunch of folks who, have been in school for a lot of their lives and maybe, I don't want to stereotype, but I'm a nerd. Maybe a lot of our fellow academicians are nerds and now they have power. And so, how do you do this?
Hmm.
And then I would also say, we're trained to do one thing, and then we often go into leadership or management, which is different. We're
Yeah.
trained to be good psychologists. Then, for many of us, we got promoted because we're good psychologists or researchers or accountants or
Hmm.
engineers or programmers. That doesn't mean you know how to lead. Even
Hmm.
psychologists don't necessarily know how to be good leaders and managers. And so I love that transition point, and trying to figure out what is it that people want
Yeah.
and then how are they trying to get it and how can, I don't know, how can we work together on this? How can we try
Yeah.
to maximize the amount of good that we all get out of this situation or out of the funding or out of the project or whatever?
Yeah, I love what you're talking about here, Jennifer, because what you're actually talking about is looking at politics not in the negative light that most people, including myself, do, but really looking at it as a leadership tool to help you get what you need and to be successful. And one of the things that I really loved when I heard you speak the other day was you used the word administructure, and I've never heard of that word, and I think you made it up, but you were using it in reference to, how do you get through a bureaucratic setting, and including politics, to be able to be successful. So can you share a little bit more about that, because I think that's such a novel concept.
Yeah, absolutely. So administructure is a word I made up, trademark pending, but it's the integration of administrative and infrastructure. And so
Hmm.
my formal definition of it is the strategic and explicit integration of people, structures, processes, and change
Hmm.
to ensure that an organization meets its goals effectively and efficiently, supports and develops its staff, and responds to the environment in ways consistent with its values. And there's so much packed into that, but it
Hmm.
really is. I mean, I kind of think of it as like an org psych theory of everything
Yeah.
because it includes so many different things, but it's talking about how to strategically and intentionally use the resources at your disposal. And
Hmm.
what I find, not just at your disposal, but other resources you might be able to get, what I find is that everyone gets frustrated with administrators, administrative rules, processes, all that other kinds of thing. But it's rare to find someone who really knows how to wield power and use those administrative resources and processes to their advantage. And that's
Hmm.
what I'm trying to help people do. How can you clarify what your goals are, identify what are the infrastructure needs and resources you may have available, how do you maximize those to be able to meet your goals and develop your staff and make everything happen in the way you'd
Hmm.
like it to happen.
Yeah, I love this approach because it's holistic, and I love holistic approaches. You're dealing with the organization as a whole. You're talking about the people. You're talking about the resources, change. You're talking about all the things that happen, right? And how do they integrate
Right.
and interact together? I'm wondering, can you share some examples of how you've seen this work in terms of the administrature process and how an organization can benefit from looking at all of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the examples that I have is a place that I worked that was around, it's a university working on research infrastructure,
Hmm.
research operations, and um, federally funded research like National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, and so on, has a gazillion policies related to everything,
Hmm.
including how you submit the proposals to get funded. Once it gets funded, what you do with all the money, how you track this, who does that, and kind of accounting principles as well. One person should be uh, initiating the accounting activity. Another one should be approving it. You should have the same
Hmm.
person initiating and approving. So these are things that many people just take for granted. If you're an accountant, this is like old hat. You know this stuff. But we're working with, at this university, we're working with faculty members who are amazing at epidemiology or oncology or psychology or chemistry, and they're
Hmm.
not accountants, and
Yeah.
they shouldn't have to be. So part of what I worked on and what my team worked on was, how do we make this, all of these rules that the university is responsible for and that the
Hmm.
faculty are responsible for, accessible to them? And so, how do we try to figure out, what I tried to do is figure out, how do we get exactly the right information the faculty researchers needed at exactly the right time, not too much, not too
Hmm.
soon, but definitely not too late, and then
Yeah.
help them understand what they needed to do and take responsibility for that, all in the context of a university where they're there to be teachers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was quite a challenge, and it definitely didn't do it perfectly, but it really helped me understand, how do you use this infrastructure, how do you use the administrature to get things done, how do you communicate with people, how do you make sure they have information that they need to be able to make the decisions they need to make.
Hmm.
So as another example, faculty would need to, if they have a grant, they need to oversee their budget. Of course
Right.
they need to oversee their budget. Well, that means they need to have access to information about their budgets,
Hmm.
timely access. It's like trying to run your household finances and you never get a bank statement and you can't look online. So how do you know what you have? Like, it's just not, you can't make good decisions if you don't have that information. So how do
Hmm.
we harness the administrature and the infrastructure to get information where it needs to go without overwhelming them with too much information that they don't need?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of that interaction between people and process, right? How do you get
Yes.
people and process to work well together, right? Is that am
Yep.
I hearing it right there?
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I,
Yeah.
I love
And
that because I think one of the things that from my experience that I've come to realize is that you know especially when you have an organization that's big and bigger, and there's so many things that, as you've described here, process is key, right? But the people, if you don't have the people using the process is useless, right? Because how many times have you seen a process that's written and documented, but the way people actually do things is completely different than what's written and documented? And so how do you get the
Right.
people to actually follow a process? It's really important.
Right. And I think of this, I use this metaphor a lot when I'm teaching about leadership, is it's like starting the wave. If you
Mm-hmm.
want people to do stuff, you're standing up and raising your hands and you're point in the circle. And sometimes you can get really exhausted doing this over and over and over again. You're the only one doing the wave and you feel
Mm-hmm.
silly and you keep pointing. And eventually, like you keep trying all these different strategies to get other people to see the importance of this, to understand the process, to get the
Mm-hmm.
training on the process, to make it like align incentives to make it easier for them to do the thing than it is to not do the thing. And
Yeah.
then help them get excited about it and all of those things. Like keep trying all of those different things and eventually somebody else is going to do the wave with you. And then there's two of you and that is so exciting. And then somebody else will do it and then somebody else will do it. And then you're not going to be able to think of a time when people weren't doing the wave because everybody's doing it and then you can move on to the next thing.
Yeah, that sounds
But it
it sounds like a slow but really a very intentional process as well, right? You have to
very
be very intentional about bringing each person along to join you in the wave.
Absolutely. And that's one of the places where I love this intersection between psychology and organizational change
Mm-hmm.
because there's some psychoanalytic approaches that say whenever there's organizational change, there's grief about the loss of what used to be. Maybe
Yeah.
it's the loss of being able to know how to do everything in this process.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's the loss of I don't have to think that hard or feeling confident or people come to me for answers. And then now that things are going to be different, I don't know what's next. And that's very real. Like that is something that people experience. And I think many times, certainly when I was getting started, I would have it in my head. This makes logical sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like you complain about the process. So here's a new process that will solve all those problems you were complaining about. Why are you not happy with this?
Mm-hmm.
So I was focusing on the logic and rationality without focusing as much as I should and as I
Yeah.
do now on the human side of it about loss and change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that because it's a great segue into the next thing I want to talk about, which is the psychology behind getting people to do things, right? The psychology
Yeah.
behind the people and the process and the infrastructure and all of those things that you've talked about. It all depends on the people, right? So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what is it about your experience or your training as a psychologist that helps you to be able to see the intricacies here that others might be missing that really helps people in a business, in an organization, in academia, where it's really hard to get anyone to do anything, to actually start to engage.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love psychology. I was
Hmm.
undergraduate social psychology major and then went into clinical and then did organizational stuff. But
Hmm.
there's so much that I rely on all the time: learning, communication, motivation, family systems,
Hmm.
power, problem solving, leadership, strategy. Like there's so much that's
Hmm.
amazing. One of the things that I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this, one of the strategies that I have used the most, and this is going to sound silly, but it's something that I started using when I was a student doing cognitive behavioral therapy with
Hmm.
8-year-old kids with attention deficit disorder. And that was an everybody happy plan.
Oh my
And what
gosh.
we would teach these kids is if there's a problem, first identify the problem. What are some potential solutions?
Yeah.
Evaluate the solutions, pick a solution, and then do it and see how it went. I mean, simple problem solving, also
Hmm.
similar to the scientific method. It's similar to basically any kind of problem solving strategy.
Right.
But that everybody happy plan, like how can we find a way to make everybody, if not happy, at least satisfied or okay with how
Mhm.
things are moving? I have used that over and over again as like the wave metaphor
Yeah.
as well. I've used it all the time because it's so basic. Everyone can understand it. And then sometimes people get a kick out of it when I talk about kids on the kids on the playground using this method, like we can start there. That's a place where we can start.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the places where I have found some disagreement with that is that some people, I don't want to say a lot of people, some people don't care if everybody's happy. They just
Hmm.
want what they want. And so, okay, that's good information to have.
Right.
If you don't care what the other people are thinking about or what they want, okay, so let's try a different approach. I mean, the same problem solving approach still works. You
Yeah.
just don't have to care. You're choosing not to care about whether everybody's happy. You're making yourself happy. Okay, so what are the consequences of that? What are the likely consequences? And let's
And
build
that
that
happens
in
in
as we
business as well,
evaluate it.
right? I mean, that's what you
Totally.
described happens a lot in business.
Of
It's
course.
sometimes I can't think about you because I have if we're competing for a promotion and I'm out for myself, and so I'm really not that fussed about if you don't get it because I want it.
Right. And then that brings me back to, I guess, if it gets me right back to psychology around, I wonder what kind of approach and perspective and personality and values this person has,
Mm-hmm.
where maybe they view everything as limited resources and there's
Mm-hmm.
not enough for everybody.
Yeah.
In some situations, that's true. If there's one promotion and two people vying for it, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
But other people, they approach everything as win lose
Mm-hmm.
when they don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
There could be ways to lift other people. And I love the idea of lifting as you climb. I'm
Mm-hmm.
first generation college, only person in my family with a graduate degree. I joined the army to get money for college. And there's so many people who have been amazing mentors and supports to me. Not who I thought would be mentors and supports,
Yeah.
but kind of other kind of random angels in my life who helped me. And I want to pass that along. There's so many smart, talented people who are in families that haven't had college before or who don't really know what the next steps are. And there's so many things that no one ever tells you, which is why that's a big part of what I train about. That's a big part of what I write about, what I speak about. Here's the stuff that no one ever tells you about how to move ahead or how to get what you're looking for.
I love what you said there, lifting as you climb. I really appreciate that you're doing that in the academic setting, which I think is really really hard. So I I appreciate that you're doing that there. But I know you also work in the healthcare industries. Can you tell us
Mhm.
about a little bit about some of the work that you do there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of three main areas that I work in across both academia and healthcare. So, one is research.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was a researcher for 20 years, and I do mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative research, and a lot of social science stuff. So, I've done a lot of training people on how to conduct research, training people how to write proposals.
Mm-hmm.
I've done some research administration, organizational change, so I can help organizations build up their research infrastructure to be able
Mm-hmm.
to be competitive for federal grants or for foundation grants or for contracts. So that's kind of one part, that research part. Second part is leadership, training people on how to be leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly love working with kind of that first line new manager group,
Mm.
people who are amazing and talented psychologists or physicians or accountants or engineers, and now they're leaders. So how do
Why
I
that
work
group?
with
That's an
those?
interesting group. Why? Because that seems like a hard group. Why that group?
I just really relate. There's so many people are coming into like their first leadership role. People are often excited about it and they
Mm-hmm.
want to do it right. And there's a lot of enthusiasm. They're not quite jaded about politics. They're not, they haven't been maybe haven't experienced some of the negative repercussions of leadership. But as they're going through and absorbing so much information about kind of their staff, and maybe they were a colleague and now they got promoted to now they're people supervisor where they used to be their
Yeah.
friends. Kind of how do they manage that? How do they manage, like, I like doing clinical work and now I'm a manager and I don't get to do it as much. And how do I work with people in a very different way? I'm just fascinated at that transition and that process of learning to use the skills you used in your kind of content expertise, accounting
Mm-hmm.
or clinical or whatever, and to use those as a manager.
You said something that really is I think is key here that I don't think I've actually recognized before is there is a transition that is required. From going from being doing clinical work or administrative work or whatever it is that you're doing to being a manager and a leader, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
transition that's involved in that.
Yeah.
and we need to pay attention to that and help people in that transition. It sounds like you're doing a lot of that work helping people transition.
I love that transition. Like that. As you know, I wrote the Millennials Guides book. So I wrote Millennials Guide to Management and Leadership and talk about how to ease into that role. Some people get kind of tossed into it when they
Yeah.
get a promotion. Other people are looking for leadership opportunities and they don't know how to make that happen. They don't really know what it is to be a leader, what it
Yeah.
means, what their role is. Some people think it's just getting more money to do the same work, and that doesn't usually work well. But that kind of leads me to the kind of third area: do research, leadership, and then the third one is process improvement and change management. So when people
Hmm.
want to change their organization, that's the third area I can focus on. And most of the time, I'm doing either change management or research, and I work the leadership part into there.
Right.
So if you're doing research, you also get leadership from me. If you're doing
Hmm.
change management, you also get leadership.
Hmm.
And if you're transitioning into being a manager, you also
Yeah.
get leadership. That just kind of comes with everything I
I
do.
love that, right? Nothing is in isolation, right? So what you're doing is
Right.
you're just acknowledging the integration, right, of these things and helping to weave them along. So I really think
Yep.
that's really awesome. Jennifer, we could talk forever, but I want to be
Yeah.
respectful of time. So
Yeah.
how do people get a hold of you? Because I know you're doing such great work and you've got your own consulting company. How do they get on your website or email you or follow you, or how do people get a hold of you?
Sure, sure. So my website is leadwithwisdom.com,
Hmm.
and my email is jennifer@leadwithwisdom.com. I am not on too much social media, so email is usually the best way to get in touch with me, and you could read about what I do and see some examples of my work on the website. And then, as I mentioned, I do a lot of writing as well. So
Hmm.
millennialsguides.com has a lot of information about the different millennials guides to management leadership, to work, to workplace politics, and others. And then I also have a book that talks a lot about transitions called Leaving Revolution, how we're
Hmm.
learning to let go and move on. And that talks about how do you know when it's time to go and how do you think through that whole process.
Awesome. Those are great books, and I'll definitely make sure that I get those. Jennifer, I want to take advantage of the fact that you're here and ask for some free advice
Yep.
for anybody who's listening. You know, who's a business leader or a manager or anybody who's transitioning. What advice or tips would you give to people out there in the business world today?
I think my number one piece of advice is to be very clear on what you want.
Hmm.
If you're not clear about your goals, how can you expect your staff to be clear about your goals and do the things that they need to do? Um, if you're not clear about your goals, what are you doing?
Hmm. Yeah.
What are you doing? I'm a bit of a goals nerd. I clarify my goals in different areas around um, finances and around health and around work and around
Hmm.
other ways that I spend my time. But being intentional
Mm.
in where you want to go, and then making sure that you're always checking, am I spending my time in a way that's going to get me where I want to go, and that's how I want to spend it. It's as
Hmm.
opposed to just kind of falling into doing things that are easy or a habit or something like that. So clarifying goals and communicating those is really my number one tip. That seems really easy, but it's a lot harder to do.
Yeah, I love that tip, because what you've struck on there for me is that you have to be intentional about these things. You use that word intentional, and you have to pay attention to it and focus on it and give it that extra attention. Right? It's not just going to happen. Your goals just aren't going to
Right,
clarify themselves. You actually have to make sure that you are clarifying them, that you understand it fully before you can even explain it to somebody else. Right? I
right.
I love that tip. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been fantastic. There's so much that we didn't cover. I definitely want to have you back on to walk us through administructure in a little more detail and really help us to figure out how we can use it. So definitely hope that we can get you back on the show at some point.
Absolutely. I'd love to. This is a lot of fun.
Great. Well, thanks for being on the show, and for everybody else, hopefully we will catch you next time. Thanks all. Bye.